Hello and welcome to Cold Wars and Beyond, Part 8. Now we'll be looking at the change that occurred in Asia during the final decades of the Cold War and into modern times.
And now for something completely different.
Now looking at Japan, one of the world's most developed countries, they experienced a lost decade beginning around the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. A combination of very high land values and low interest rates led to massive borrowing and heavy investment in things like stocks and real estate. The government sharply raised interest rates in 1989, causing the bubble to burst, along with the stock and real estate markets. A debt crisis followed, which wasn't catastrophic for most people. The Japanese tend to have high savings, but companies were definitely weakened. Japan's national debt grew to more than 200% of its GDP, which, by the way, is a very bad thing. Higher unemployment, less job security, and very low growth has plagued Japan ever since, and it still has not fully recovered, which is why this time frame has often been called the lost 2 decades. To add insult to injury, in March 2011, a massive earthquake off Japan's coast triggered a powerful tsunami. Together they caused more than 25,000 deaths. The tsunami also caused the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which was the first major nuclear meltdown since Chernobyl in 1986. Nonetheless, as you can see with the country data in the chart, and looking at the population pyramid, Japan is still one of the richest and most developed countries on the planet. Comparing Japan with the rest of the world, you can see it ranks toward the top in terms of health, represented by life expectancy, wealth, represented by per capita income and its economic structure, as well as education, represented by literacy. This data, taken together, clearly qualifies Japan as an MDC. Now, China had begun massive industrialization under Mao Zedong. However, in 1976, Mao died due to a heart attack. Afterward, a power struggle emerged between the competing Communist Party officials. The group that lost was the Gang of Four, consisting of Mao's widow and 3 others. This one was Mao's widow. Yeah. They were major leaders during the Cultural Revolution, but were put on trial and then imprisoned. This marked a change in which China became more moderate, similar to when Stalin died more than 2 decades earlier. Deng Xiaoping became the new leader of China in 1978 and held the position until 1992. Most of the Maoist reforms were abandoned. Government control became less strict, and they moved toward a mixed economy in what was referred to as a socialist market economy. Starting in 1980, China established many specialized economic zones, mostly along the East Coast, to enact some capitalist reforms. Managers were allowed to act more freely, and profits were allowed. Nonetheless, most regions, especially in the interior, remained far less developed, experiencing abject poverty, and unlike European socialist countries, China still remained communist. Nothing showed this better than the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Over 100,000 mourners and demonstrators descended on Beijing in the summer, after the death of Hu Yaobang, a high-ranking official who supported many democratic and capitalist reforms. 1989 saw the fall of the Communist bloc and the Berlin Wall, and the diffusion of this democratic movement spread to China. The result was a government crackdown in which they sent in armed forces to disperse the crowd. True numbers will perhaps never be known, but an estimated more than 2,500 were killed and more than 7,000 were wounded. Thousands more were arrested, and democracy essentially died in China. And what you're seeing here is the bravery of the unknown rebel. He stood in front of a column of tanks the morning after violence had begun. Very little has been confirmed about his fate after that confrontation. China became one of the fastest growing world economies, in large part due to their cheap labor and cheap currency. In 1997, Britain returned to China the territory of Hong Kong, one of the 4 Asian tigers. And China agreed to allow Hong Kong to remain largely autonomous for 50 years. The Chinese government still promotes nationalism and endorses a collective mindset, and the Chinese people are behind what is known as the Great Firewall, where they are under constant surveillance and the government enforces strict censorship. And looking at China's country data, even though they are the world's 2nd largest economy, their rankings in terms of individual health, wealth, and education categorizes China as an NIC. Elsewhere is the Asian giant of India, the 3rd largest economy in the world. India's wealth expanded greatly in the 1990s when their socialist government reduced regulation and privatized many state-owned enterprises. India also joined the Nuclear Club in 1998, meaning they have developed and tested nuclear weapons. Now, their economy began to slow down in the early 2010s, and even though collectively India is one of the largest economic powers in the world, individually they rank toward the bottom third in terms of health, wealth, and education, qualifying India as an NIC. India is one of the world's most influential secondary industrial regions, specializing in the outsourcing of services, information technology, and software design. Now, Pakistan is officially a democratic republic, but essentially is little more than a dictatorship in actuality. They, like India, joined the nuclear club in 1998. Pakistan remains as a low-income and underemployed country. Although they are far from the poorest nation in the world, they are clearly an LDC. Now, Vietnam and the surrounding region represented a failure of containment during the Cold War. After Vietnam fell to communism, more than 1 million refugees, known primarily as the Boat People, fled the country. But even more tragic is what happened to the people of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge, a communist party, took control of Cambodia in 1975 under the leadership of Pol Pot and orchestrated the terrible Cambodian genocide. Their goal was to establish a communist society, and they worked to de-urbanize their country, sending thousands of people from the cities to the fields. In enforcing their extreme vision, between 1.5 to 3 million people died of executions, starvation, and forced labor. The mass graves that were found afterward were known as the killing fields. Today, Vietnam is still communist, but they have grown into a mixed economy with some minor free market reforms. Nonetheless, Vietnam remains a poor and densely populated LDC. Cambodia is now a democracy, but is still one of the poorest states in all of Asia, with almost a quarter of its population living on little more than $1 a day, and with more than half of the population under the age of 25, Cambodia is clearly an LDC. Indonesia is a republic and the largest Muslim nation in the world. The 2002 Bali bombings occurred in a tourist district on the island of Bali. The attack killed over 200 people and around 240 were injured. A violent Islamic group was responsible for this. Now, you may ask why they chose Bali if Indonesia is mostly Muslim. Well, Bali is more than 90% Hindu and a popular tourist site for Europeans and Westerners. Later, in 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami occurred. A massive earthquake triggered off the coast of Sumatra, which is part of Indonesia. More than 230,000 people were killed in over 14 countries. The animation at the top shows how far the effects were felt. Today, Indonesia still struggles with poverty, unemployment, and inadequate infrastructure, which is understandable for the largest archipelagic state in the world, meaning it possesses many islands. And even though it is one of the 4 Tiger Cub economies, looking at the country data, it is still categorized as an LDC. And then there's the story of the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, otherwise known as North Korea. Kim Il-sung ruled as a fairly moderate communist leader from 1948 to 1994, working to modernize and industrialize his country. Then came Kim Jong-il, sometimes called Kim Jong mentally ill. He ruled from his father's death in 1994 until his death in 2011. In that time, North Korea became the de facto authoritarian and totalitarian communist dictatorship of the world. His son, Kim Jong-un, has been their ruler since 2012. North Korea is the least free state in the world, dominated by a strong government and large armed forces, collective farms, massive human rights violations, and widespread starvation. They claim to have stopped their nuclear weapons program, but many doubt the veracity of this. In this image, you can see the stark difference in development between North Korea and its neighbors. To save energy at night, the power grid is shut down across most of North Korea, with the exception of its capital, Pyongyang. North and South Korea constitute a multi-state nation, 2 people divided, not by geography.
Yes, well!
They are divided by political ideology. Despite vast resources, North Korea remains an LDC, whereas its southern neighbor, the Republic of Korea, or South Korea, is one of the 4 Asian tigers and has achieved MDC status, with its high rates of health, wealth, and education. There is perhaps nowhere else in the world where the stark differences between communism and capitalism can be seen so clearly. The continent of Asia is truly a vast region with vast differences and vast resources. It is undoubtedly one of the most influential regions in our multipolar world today.
Groovy.